Thank you, Bertil. I think we have a very long discussion. Now, we covered the peace process in ethnic states, in ethnic armies, EOs. Now, I want you to talk about China, Burma's powerful neighbor. I want to hear your thought on China's political clout, geopolitical ambitions. And because of, we often debate and talk about China's roles in Myanmar's internal affairs and internal conflicts, how China interfere in Myanmar's domestic affairs. So, and also China's geopolitical ambition and access to Indian Ocean.
Well, first of all, you have to look at the map of China. It's a huge inland empire, a comparatively short coastline for such a big country. And when China decided to change its economic system from socialism to capitalism, the development model was export. The export industry was developed in order to give the country incomes and so on, and lift living standards. And the coastal provinces took off immediately because naturally the ports were there, and that's where the production was taking place. There was Guangdong, there was Fujian, and later on Shanghai. Whereas the landlocked inland provinces were lagging behind. And the difference in income between the coastal provinces and the landlocked inland provinces was becoming so severe, so it could actually threaten the entire unity of the country. Because China is actually massive, it's more than a country, it's huge. And you have many very different ethnic groups there as well. So back in the 1980s, the Chinese started to look at possibilities for development, export-oriented development in the landlocked inland provinces. And this was published in the official Beijing Review in 1985, official magazine.
Yes, I have read that one.
Opening to the southwest. Where they mentioned that the three provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, with a combined population of 100 million people, there's no way they could develop an industry there and send goods to China's own ports. They had to find an outlet through another country. And if you look at the whole of China, the same thing applies. And the only three countries which borders China that have a direct access to the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, and making it easier than promoting exports to China's own ports. That's Burma, India, Pakistan. India, forget about it. There's no way they're going to help the Chinese. Pakistan, yes, there is a highway there, the Karakoram Highway. But it's one of the most dangerous highways in the world. And then you, of course, have all the political turmoil in Pakistan, which is, can be quite frightening. So it's actually only one country that provides an easy and convenient access to the Indian Ocean for China. And that is, yes. And so, therefore, you can say that China has long-term strategic interests in Burma, which other countries don't have. The West can talk about human rights and democracy and that sort of thing, which is, of course, good, but it wouldn't have any real impact on what's happening in the country. And India is, of course, worried about Chinese influence, but so far they haven't been very successful in countering it. Whereas China has gone full speed ahead in developing relations with the country. Actually, regardless of who is in power, even when Aung San Suu Kyi became state councillor, the Chinese embassy was the first to congratulate her on her, the election victory at that time. She was not,
and she was invited to China even before the election in 2015, and she met with President Xi Jinping.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the Chinese, they would prefer to have a stable military government in power.
Weak.
Yeah, but not too strong, but
not democratic.
No, they wouldn't like that. But let's say that. But even when Aung San Suu Kyi was not running the country, but because they were still being run by the military, you have to remember that. But she was at least running the government. The Chinese made an effort to establish very close and cordial relations with her and the NLD as well. So my argument is that if you have to look at China's long-term strategic interests. They would prefer a government which they can deal with more easily, in a non-democratic government. But if there is a democratic government, they would deal with that too, in their own way, of course. And China's relations to the various EAOs follows the same kind of
Yes,
pattern.
that's my next question. You know, in the past, the communist China exported revolution to neighboring countries, including Burma. So, but today China wants to export goods and wants to trade with the neighboring countries. And we are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, gigantic projects. We have a China-Myanmar economic corridor, which will start. We have between China and Burma has a signed agreement to implement so many mega projects. Some of the projects will start in Shan State. There has been a feasible studies has been done, as far as we understand. And there are so many EAO and Malaysia active in Shan States. A lot of CMEC projects will start from the Shan States. In these areas, EAO like WA, Gogan, TNLA, even Arakan Army or AA, China has been providing arms and support to those groups. The northern part seems to be part of the China's enclavement. So, but last 5 years, 6 years, we also saw China is aggressively involved in a Myanmar peace process. Can you tell us more on this subject? And also, I want to ask you a quick question. Can China be trusted?
Well, this question is very easy to answer. No. And trusted in the sense that they're interested in genuine peace in the country. They are not. Because it's not in their interest. If you look at the United World State Army, and the Kokang as well, the basic successor to the CPB, the Communist Party of Burma, we received massive support from China from the late 60s until the 1980s. At that time, China was exporting a revolution. Now they're exporting consumer goods. But it would be foolish of the Chinese to give up that foothold they had inside the country through the CPB because of the 1989 mutiny. They probably had even better relations with some of the world leaders than they ever had with the CPB, because they speak the same language to begin with. And most world leaders speak Chinese as a second language, whereas very few of the CPB leaders ever did that. And so, of course, and if you look at the arms that the WA have, they're more sophisticated, they're more heavily armed than the CPB ever was. And all those guns are coming from China, period. There's no discussion about that. It doesn't matter how much China's think tankers deny that, right? But then, if you look at the broader picture, let's say, for argument's sake, tomorrow, all the ethnic groups sit down and agree that, yes, we will have a federation or a confederation. It will look like this. They sign an agreement. There's no more fighting in the country. There's peace. And all the armed groups will become local police forces or something else. Who will be the first to lose? China. It's not their interest to see that. China wants to have a certain degree, they don't like total chaos because there will be refugees coming into Yunnan and so on. But they're not interested in stability either because then they can't control anything. And they want to have a certain degree of stability over which they exercise some degree of control. And that is actually the situation now.
They want to keep the forces against each other.
Yes, sure, definitely. It's not really interesting to see them give up the struggle, not now. Maybe sometime in the future, we don't know, but certainly it's not an interest today. So therefore China is not interested in peace. They're interested in the kind of situation and to make the country, the country shouldn't be too stable because then they can't control it. And they should have connections with everybody. Because I mean, China has a very peculiar foreign policy. They differentiate between government-to-government relations and party-to-party relations. Which is quite ridiculous in a country where there's only one political party and the party controls the government in China. But so they have government-to-government relations with whoever is in power in Yangon previously, now Naypyidaw. But party-to-party relations, they can have that with anyone. So they have a party-to-party relations with the WA, with the Kachin, and with the NLD, with the USDP, with everyone. And they can say, oh, no, this is different. This is party to party, nothing, not government to government. But of course, it's all part of a government strategy. And the government strategy is mapped out by the party, which controls the government.
This year, April, Chinese foreign minister invited the Myanmar foreign minister, Burmese foreign minister, to China. Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, no matter how the situation changes, China will support Myanmar in safeguarding its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, in exploring development paths suited to its national conditions.
Well,
but we were discussing before, just before we were discussing how China trying to control the forces inside the country. And we talk about China enclavement. And now China was promising Burmese they will respect their territorial integrity.
But they've never done that. First, they supported the CPB for 20 years. And then they have all these relations with these other EAOs on the border. So they've always been a player in domestic politics in Burma, especially when it comes to the various armed organizations there.
What will happen to Burma or Shan State in particular, where a lot of huge projects are coming in the next 10 to 20 years, whether we like it or not? This is quite worrying that Chinese are coming, and even the war, known to be proxy of China, moving to the southern part of Shan State. Thailand is also looking at it with the worry.
Well, I don't think China would want to annex certain parts of the country. That's not the way they exercise influence and how they expand their spheres of influence. I mean, actually, what China is doing in Burma today, the plan, predates the Belt and Road Initiative. But already, as I said, in the 80s, they were looking at waterways, railways, roadways through Burma, from Yunnan down to the Indian Ocean. And they were talking about how they should be developed. And of course, that is interference. It's not just help. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. I mean, they have an economic and political and strategic interest in controlling the China-Myanmar economic corridor, as it is called today. And they are going to continue doing that. But if you look at the EAOs there, we also have to remember that even though they are very dependent on China, they could also exist without what they're getting from across the border. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily that pro-Chinese, or pro-China, let's put it that way. The Kachin's, we know they're not. I mean, they're Christians, and they're not really trusted by the Chinese either. That's why the Chinese are not giving them any weapons. They have to get it from other sources. Even the Wa, they're not happy about the Chinese dominance. They're fiercely independent people. And they know how the Chinese central authorities treated the Wa in China in the 1950s. They haven't forgotten that.
China is not trusted. I got it. But today, Chinese government seems to be backing and supporting the military regime in Burma that Burmese people hate and despise, and Burmese people are loathed. Last year, we saw anti-China, one of the biggest anti-China demonstrations took place in Yangon and other cities. Chinese factories were attacked. Later last year and this year, we've seen local armed groups, opposition groups made a threat to the Chinese companies and the gas pipeline and copper mines inside the country. Now, Chinese also trying to reach out to some opposition members as well as to NUG government ASL, asking them to protect the Chinese interest and Chinese business in the country. And Chinese also ask the regime to protect at all costs, to prevent any attack to the Chinese interest, the Chinese business in Burma.
Well, it sort of underlines the whole thing that the way China is reacting to this, that they even started talking to the National Unity Government and all the armed groups and that sort of thing, on a party-to-party basis. So when the long-term strategic interests remain the same, and that is the corridor, the outlet to the sea, the outlet to the Indian Ocean. And therefore they have to play, they cannot afford to antagonize certain groups because they would backfire. But during the Slok days, they actually put all the eggs in one basket. They supported only the military. And they had basically no links to the opposition at all. Of course, with some of the EAOs, but they were sort of different. But even there, they showed a certain degree of flexibility, that they didn't really want to antagonize, not even NLD during its early days of its existence. And I can tell you a little anecdote which actually reflects that in a way, in a very peculiar kind of way. You know, after the 88 uprising, everyone was at Aung San Suu Kyi's compound on University Avenue. And all the activists, the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians and so on, the journalists and everybody. And all the Western embassies went there to meet her and the NLD leaders. The Chinese diplomats did not. But one day, and this was actually told, I can tell you the story now because there was Michael Aries, Aung San Suu Kyi's husband, late husband, who told me that he's gone now, and I don't think he would mind my telling you this story. And he was there, of course, in the house on University Avenue. But he said the Chinese diplomats never came to talk to Suu Kyi. But one day, they saw a car, the diplomatic number plate, Chinese embassy, coming into University Avenue. And everyone was surprised. And then a junior officer from the embassy came with a big box full of books in Tibetan, about Tibetan Buddhism. It was their way of indirectly saying that we are careful, but we are not, don't look at us as we are some kind of enemy. There was not Suu Kyi, it was their husband. There was about Tibetan Buddhism. But that gesture showed that, I think everyone, that even at that time, the Chinese wanted to maintain a certain degree of flexibility. They didn't even know if the military government was going to survive or not, or what the future would look like. Because again, the long-term interest, they remain the same. And they're playing various games accordingly. So that's what happened.
Yeah, but last 30 years, since Slok SPDC came into power, we've seen a massive exploitation of natural resources by Chinese in the northern part of Myanmar.
Yes, and in the one state is tin and rare earth metals. When it's talking about Chinese exports of rare earth metals, it's only half the truth. Most of it actually comes from the Wahils. The Chinese, they also have 2 rare earth mines up in Kachin state. And so, I mean, of course, the export of this kind of items makes it possible for these armed groups like the KO, the KIA, and the United West State Army to maintain their organization and get more arms and run their various, whatever they have inside their respective areas. But so they're dependent on each other in a way. But I always argue that if there was a central government in Burma with a more enlightened approach to people like the Wa, the problem could be solved. I think they would be happier staying with Myanmar than to be some kind of, totally dependent on China. But so far, it is so easy to dismiss them as drug traffickers and whatnot, which they are. I mean, they use to trade in drugs. There's no doubt about that. But today, the sources of income have become much more diversified. And even if they get money from drugs, who hasn't done that in Burma, including the government?
Last year, Chinese special envoy visited Burma twice after the coup, and he reportedly asked General Min Aung Hlaing to allow him to meet detained State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. It was declined. But again, we heard the news that Chinese told Burmese not to disband the National League for Democracy. Do you think Chinese has a political leverage over Burma compared to other Western countries or Western governments?
Yeah. Well, you also have to remember that, as you mentioned before, the Burmese military is fairly xenophobic.
Right.
They have not forgotten the long and bitter war with the Communist Party of Burma, how the soldiers were killed, the boys were killed with Chinese guns. And there's a retired officer once told me, it's like a scar in the heart. They cannot forget that. And then, of course, in the beginning, after the coup in '88, they had to rebuild or strengthen the armed forces. At that time, there was only China that was willing to sell them anything. But they became so dependent on China, so they had to look for alternatives. They didn't want to have this heavy dependence on China. So then they unfortunately turned towards Russia. And of course, they worked for a while, but it's not going to work much longer, but given what's happening in Ukraine right now. So they're back in the Chinese camp, very reluctantly, and I don't know how they want to handle that. And they're probably not particularly happy about it either. And the Chinese, of course, they know this. They know that the military doesn't like them, that they don't trust them. I think actually they find it easier to deal with Aung San Suu Kyi than with Min Aung Hlaing, in a way, in this very strange and peculiar way. So there was even some reports, I think, before the 2015 elections that the Chinese wanted to see that they win rather than the USDP. Maybe because they would give the country a bit more degree of stability at that time, and instead of military rule, which would be resented by everyone. But the Chinese are playing all these different games at the same time. And it's very important to look at the bigger picture and see a pattern and see what it leads to. They don't just side with one particular actor or one particular group. And therefore, the Chinese foreign policy, the Chinese policy towards Burma, is very different from that of Western countries, which is more sort of ideologically motivated.
Definitely, Burmese people, including the military, they are xenophobia. Burmese people in general are pro-Western. They are not pro-China. And then, over the past decades, we've seen the US has politically invested in Burma, promoting democracy, human rights, and press freedom in Burma or Myanmar. Recently, the US has invited the foreign minister of NUG to Washington, D.C. US-ASEAN Special Summit was taking place. Definitely, there were competition between US and China. I think there were competition, rivalries between US and China. And then this Cold War mentality is coming to Indo-Pacific region, including ASEAN. Burma is also one of the countries that the US and China trying to gain their influence. What is your thought?
Well, I mean, if the United States wants to get more influence in the country, they have to also be a little more active than they are today. And
like Ukraine?
Well, maybe not to send all its weapons they've been sending to Ukraine. Maybe there's another way of doing it. But certainly, it seems that Burma is now on the back burner when it comes to American foreign policy. They're much more they're preoccupied with Ukraine, what's happening in Europe. So therefore, because the road is wide open for the Chinese.
What I remember was in 2007, 2008, U.S. policy was very consistent with the engaging Burma stakeholders and all sides, all forces. It was very active and I would say quite impressive.
If you look at America's and Washington's Burma policy towards engaging everyone there, it predates the 2015 election victory for the NLD. Even during Thein Sein, he was invited to the White House, And I think the Chinese at that time felt, and I've actually seen translations of articles in Chinese academic journals saying that we have lost Burma to the West. That's the way the Chinese felt. And therefore they had to reestablish their influence in Burma. And they did so very cleverly, really. Suddenly started talking to more so-called stakeholders, a term I really don't like, but in the country, not just the government. They started engaging the media, for instance. They've never done that before. They invited journalists to China, and they started talking to journalists. And the ambassador in Rangoon suddenly answered the phone when journalists rang him. And they went to talk to all the different political parties, in a way to counter the spread of American influence. Economically, of course, they were always much stronger than the States when it comes to investment and so on. But when it comes to sort of people-to-people relations, they were way behind the Americans at that time, and they tried to reestablish some kind of, not reestablish because they never had any, but to establish some kind of better relationship with the public, the general public in Burma. If they succeeded or not, I'm not sure. I don't really think so. But at least they tried. They realized that it was important. They couldn't just lose Burma to the West, as some of the academics said at the time.
I'm curious, do you think Aung San Suu Kyi has a role in the future? She's now 77.
No, I mean, she's done her thing, and she's meant a lot to the people of Burma. That role she has played cannot be denied by anybody. But she's old and she's tired, and there are many young people who even become critical of her because they think she could have handled things in a different way.
The missteps.
Yes, exactly. So I think we have to wait for the next generation. And when I say next generation, I mean among the Burmans as well as in the ethnic groups. Because many of the ethnic leaders are also stuck in the past, in old visions, old ideas. They don't really know how to move forward.
And my last question. Any democratic transitions will stall in any country unless the powerful armed forces are brought under the civilian control in the context of a balance between executive power and the legislative branches of government. Democracy can exist only where soldiers are the servants, not the master of the state. The military in Burma is different. The Burmese army is unlikely to assume the servant's role. So until it does, the prognosis for Burmese democracy cannot be good. Because Myanmar military is going to stay in power indefinitely.
That's what they want to do, yes. We have to remember also when the military first seized power in 1962, there was at a time when there were military coups all over the world, in the so-called Third World. I mean, Thailand had coups. There was a couple of years later turmoil in Indonesia, Africa, Latin America, and so on. But in most countries, the military were content with seizing political power, whereas they left economic power or the running of the economy to other interests. Like in Thailand, for instance, there was a marriage of convenience between the military and the Sino-Thai plutocracy. And they left them run the business, and of course that's why Thailand is fairly prosperous today. Indonesia, a very similar kind of arrangement. And in other countries too. But the 62 coup in Burma was different because the military seized political as well as economic power. And that economic power was what they called the Burmese way to socialism. Everything was nationalized and placed under a number of military-controlled, they would say state-controlled, but that was the military-controlled state corporations. And that didn't really let go of that since then. Even when they started introducing new economic reforms after 88, they're still dependent, the military is still a very strong player. And you had the so-called cronies who was entirely dependent on military support. And that relationship between the cronies and the military is not the same as between the rich Thai entrepreneurs and the government, and the military here. Here they kind of let each other run their own thing, and then everyone benefits from it. Now the military will go after some of the cronies too. But how can they do that if they want to see the country develop? So the power structure in Burma is so different from any other country I'm aware of, really. When you have a military which is in economic and political power, and they want to control everything. And if you can break that, well, I don't know how that's going to work, to be frank. And it can only happen from within the military. And the problem there is, of course, that if there's a serious split in the military, not just some defections, then you may see, and we may have to see, a very bloody civil war.
Always great to talk to you about it. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.